Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Chai for Change. Today, I've got with me a good friend and a fellow coach, Stephen Ringer, who's got his company called Mental Health Maintenance. And so, we're going to be talking about mental health today. Let's change mental health, is what we're going to be talking about today. So, Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Stephen. I am an executive coach. My background actually was in marketing operations for over 20 years, and I changed course and became a coach due to some life experience that led me to this journey and why I started my organization, my coaching practice, Mental Health Maintenance. And I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, so glad to have you here. This is so exciting. Mental health maintenance, just that term in itself gets me thinking that there's a different way to start looking at mental health. But before we dive into that, I'm really keen to hear your story. How did you get from marketing to coaching? And what else? How did you get involved in mental health in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's pretty much the big question here. Um, we've talked about this before, but I'm happy to kind of revisit it all. I like to start in the middle, is how I call it.
Okay.
I just like to get right into it. So, about 10 years ago, I basically kind of hit a wall in my life. I was in my late 30s. I was expecting my second kid. My first child was diagnosed with like a pre-autism diagnosis at about 2 years old. So life was really challenging, and through a series of events, I ended up having a 3-day manic episode from a Friday to a Sunday. I'll always remember it. And I was then taken to the emergency room, and I was diagnosed bipolar at kind of a late stage, if you will. And for me, that really just changed and flipped the script of my life. And a lot of people are surprised when I say for the better. It truly saved my life and redefined kind of who I wanted to be in this world and things like that. And there are a lot of things that led to that. I had kind of, when I hit the wall, I started exploring some philosophy and very specifically a specific book, which is referenced by the maintenance. We might get there in a little bit. Um, and so when that happened, I kind of had a new lease on life. I kind of clean slated myself and started working on myself. Now having this bipolar diagnosis and mental health specifically coming front and center. Months later in the same year, my wife ended up having about a week long manic episode. And I had to actually have a court order to put her into the same mental hospital I was in, and she was diagnosed bipolar as well. So within about 18 months, our son was diagnosed with like pre-autism, and we both discovered we were bipolar. And a whole new life's kind of started. So I'll try to make this short, sorry. And so the last 10 years, I started incorporating the stuff I learned about mental health for myself and started embedding it in my workplace, like with my teams that I would manage. And I'd have random philosophical discussions with people during work hours. Shub, you and I have had a few of those already together as well. Um, and people really resonated with it. I was actually quite surprised. I think, and so I'll fast forward. So a year ago, I was in a very not the greatest environment of my job. It was like my third job. After I would do a year and I'd quit, and then I'd do a year and I'd quit. I kept hitting this mental challenge where I was trying to balance my mental health, but work was just becoming, it just wasn't working anymore. Let's just say that. So I left my work. I actually ended up having to go back into the mental hospital about after 9 years of mental health sobriety, I guess you want to call it. And coming out of that, I made the decision. I'm like, I can't do what I'm doing anymore. I'm unfulfilled. And I discovered coaching through a conversation with a former colleague. And she was like, you should become a coach. You'd be great at that. And I was like, oh, that sounds good. And so I entered the program about a year ago, and that's how we met. And yeah, I'm here today. So I started my company about a couple months ago, officially, Mental Health Maintenance. And I'm sure you'll ask me more about it, but that's kind
Yeah.
of the long and short. That's a very, very short version of what happened, but hopefully that helps.
Absolutely. Wow, that is quite a journey. And I don't think I've ever met anybody with a similar journey like yours. And I love that term clean slated myself. It sounds like that kind of happened to you a couple of times. It sounds like you had like the phoenix rebirth from the fire a couple of times. And wow, like having so much happen to you in 1 year must have been tough. But like to see you here on the other side is amazing. So I'm quite curious. Tell me in a gist of like the first time things happened for you. Where were you before, and where were you after you found, I guess, mental health maintenance for yourself? What was that first transition like? And then later I'll ask you about the more recent one.
Yeah, okay. That's a great question. So I relayed that I hit that wall. I was about 37 years old, and I was struggling with my wife and I were struggling with kind of the diagnosis of my first son. He was about 18 months old, and then the second one was on the way. And when that happened, your whole life kind of changed just there. Like all these things that parents dream about their kids of growing up, like all of that kind of that version of my son kind of died, and you kind of mourn that, and then you have to realize, okay, it's a new world I'm in, and then you realize how complex and alone you feel dealing with all of that. So like that was one aspect that was going on. My wife got laid off in the preceding year of our bipolar year, and then I was laid off 2 months later. Like it was just these series of events. So as I was struggling with all of that, and
And I'm remembering
I
that
love.
this was in the UK as well, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. Oh, if you want to go back there, so yeah. Our early
For my
years, my wife
UK
and I met.
listeners.
For your UK listeners, I miss the UK. My wife and I met. We both worked at America Online years back, and we met on the elevator at the office, and we basically met and were married in about 18 months. Which if you think about it now, with all of this later, like there's a little bit of bipolar kind of, let's
Foreshadowing.
just go for it, like, yeah, caution to the wind, like
I mean,
whatever,
I wouldn't think 18 months is that long, to be honest. I mean,
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
short. Yeah.
that's short. It's not super short, but
No.
I guarantee you, like everyone around us were like, "What the hell are you two
Okay.
doing?" And like that kind of stuff. Actually, there's a funny anecdote. There is we had started dating, and then she got an opportunity to move to Marseille, France,
Okay.
and I didn't speak a lick of French or anything, but we did start talking about, okay, well, if we get married, then AOL will move us both and all that. So there was this small period of time where it's like I was dating her for 2 months, and I remember my parents were out of the country and came back, and I like in one night I was like, okay, I met this girl, we've been dating for there, and now I'm about to move to France, and they're like, what? They're like, what? That kind of thing. She ended up not taking the job actually, and she wanted to invest in us. Like she basically chose me, and I remember
Mm.
that conversation where I'm like, oh, honey, I promise this is going somewhere. Honey, I'm never gonna move us abroad with what I do for a living and all that. This is an opportunity you're going to miss. But, she was so confident in us and all that, and she stayed. Um, and then the irony is, a few years later, I actually did get a job opportunity to move to London, and we did live there for about 3 years. I was doing the marketing thing and all that. It was really tough at first. Again, we don't know what we are, like, psychologically, right? But the culture shock in the beginning, like I had a very large piece of me that wanted to do really well in this job. They moved me across the Atlantic and all that other kind of stuff, and our marriage got really rickety early on. Like she was like, I'm thinking of getting a divorce. Like it was like that, and somehow, some way, like it's the care we had for one another, like just kind of kept us attached. And I think a lot of other couples would probably have broken pretty easily, especially if it was like one person was bipolar and one was not. But
Mm.
somehow, some way, we made it through there. And then we moved back to the States, and then we had kids a little bit later, and then that dovetails back into like what was going to happen. Incidentally, just so you know, we just celebrated our 20th wedding
Oh,
anniversary just a couple weeks
congratulations.
ago. So I guess we proved everyone wrong. Yeah, take that.
Well
Anywho,
done. And
so flashing back, yeah, let's go.
yeah,
Sorry.
just Quickly, would you say that
Please.
that was kind of like the flavor of your life in that phase before your first diagnosis and admission? Would you say your life was sort of constantly in the ups and downs?
Oh, that's a clear question. I'll answer it this way. So when I had my 3 day mania and I was out of it by the time they got me to the hospital, and I vividly just remember sitting there and I'm just exhausted, but I'm there. I'm lucid, like I'm totally lucid and everything. And they're like, "Hey, you're bipolar. We think you're bipolar." And my reaction was, oh. And then like 37 years of your life in an instant flash. And it was like, okay, with my mom, this time, this time, this time, this time, this time, this time, my sisters, this time, this time, this time, coworker X and all of that. And yeah, like my whole life up to then was a constant up and down, topsy turvy. I couldn't reconcile myself. I couldn't reconcile, why are things this way? Why can't I just manage this? Why can't I do this? At the same time, I had this flip of ego where I was pretty successful. People liked what I did for work and all of that. And so, um, yeah, like I mean, it's sort of it's said all the time, but like I really didn't know who I was. I just kind of was just gliding and weathering storms left and right, and I just
Mm,
never really, it was hard, like it was
yeah.
hard to, I also grew up in a multicultural family. My mom is from Korea, so there's a lot of like Asian influence when it comes to value patterns and things like that. And yeah, I mean, in the end I just never felt I measured up, even though I pretended I did.
Mm,
And I, I wrote a LinkedIn post about this, but it's like I wore lots of masks. I think we all do. Like, I had a mask for my parents. I have a mask for my manager. I had a different mask for my employees, friends, and stuff. And all of those masks are representative of you, but they're not the full picture. They're only a partial one. So I think a lot of people are like this too. Like we live a life where we're only living half of ourselves, depending on the environment and people. And I think it's much harder to truly just live as you are and be who you are with anyone. And so that's kind of part of what the bipolar thing happened, was like, I'm no longer going to be anything except who I am.
mm.
And I was confident in that because I knew at the core that who I was just to be a good person on this earth. Like that's it. So like, it's not ego, it's not anything. It's being a good person because it's the better thing to do.
Yeah, that
And
that that
so yeah,
good person is such an interesting one, and
I actually prefer a person of good
person of good.
instead of good
Okay.
person. I and part of this is from the books that I read at some point. I probably will touch upon, but it's good isn't an adjective. It's like a noun if you think of
Mm,
it that way, right? And so like a good person, like that's so loaded, and like what does that mean? But like a person who's serving good is kind of how I like to think about it.
that's such an
Sorry, I
interesting one.
interrupted you there.
No, no, no. That's such a nice way to look at it in a different sense, and makes it a lot more actionable than be like, oh, how do I be a good person? But like, if you want to be a person of good, then you just do the things that align with that, which seems a bit easier.
Yeah, sort of like that. It definitely, like it's if you say good as the adjective, you leave good to be subjective
Mm,
to a large degree, right? Because there are 7 billion versions of good on this earth that's instilled in every single being,
yeah,
right? And let's be fair, they don't match. Like person to person, city to city, country to country, continent to continent, so on and so forth,
yeah.
right? So it is a challenge when I say it that way, because then you're kind of introducing this idea of like, is there a constant of good? Like, is there just a layer of good that all people should follow? And I think there's elements through history and time and through people much smarter than me have touched upon this in different ways. But I think one of the biggest challenges that we have, really generally, whether it's mental health or anything like that, is that the struggles we have as a community of humans on the planet is that we don't have a shared nomenclature of the basic layer of good of what I'm trying to talk about. I don't know if that makes sense,
Mm.
but it's it's kind of where I go with different people and talk to them and, acknowledging that they have a different view. But I think when you start really looking under the hood of all these different, whatever, religions or what I say value patterns, like there's a lot of inherent commonality in there, but for whatever reason, we let the other objects that surround and control us to kind of get in the way of us coming to some sort of underlying truth that I think without that, good luck trying to solve all the problems we got. like that. That's just my opinion. That's just my opinion. I'm a crazy person, so who cares what I have to say?
You could say
Right?
that.
I can't say that. I'm a lad. I'm taking the word crazy back for my people.
For your
Yeah.
people. Okay. So,
Yeah.
yeah, really, really interesting. So, you had this time in your life where you got labeled in a way that opened up things for you. You
Mm-hmm.
discovered something that helped you with your own mental health maintenance, and then that's
Mm-hmm.
transformed how you live now and how you sort of transformed the way you led your teams, even in a corporate setting. Tell me more about what that other side looks like for you now. What's different?
I think the number one thing, sorry, this is a good question. I have never really thought about it. This is why things like this are great. You're really pushing the envelope on my brain. I think the number one thing, if I'm understanding your question
Mm.
right, and I'm just reflecting on me, myself, right, pre and post,
Mm-hmm.
the desire to win and to be right no longer exists for me.
Mm.
Like before, because I was working. So you said, let me put it this way. Sorry, is you phrased it that way, right? You were like, once you got your diagnosis, it opened things up. It's a good way to say it. I say it similarly to like what it did was it acknowledged my years of wondering why I couldn't operate normally like everyone else, and then being labeled bipolar, it basically freed me from the handcuffs of everyone doing what everyone was doing
Mm.
anymore. Like it basically was society saying, hey, you're not part of us the right way. Right. But for me, I was like, sweet. Like that's the first thing I needed to hear. Like, because it's like, I feel like what we're doing and how we're living right now is actually insane. Like a lot of the things that normal people do every day, like to me is like I don't understand how you reconcile this other than this is what you grew into and this is what you're used to and that's all you know. So I don't hate on anyone of it. But um so anyway, so that freedom, not that I could do whatever I want, but it was freedom to allow me to be who I am and wish to be. And the first thing about that is like, I'm no longer doing everything for my own self gain. If I gain stuff, great, that's awesome. But that's
Mm.
not my MO anymore. I want to just be a person of good each day, every day. So I'm not harming myself. I'm not harming others. I'm just trying to contribute to the betterness of this world. And so I would say, yeah, so that's the
Mm.
biggest change. And then there's a whole slew of underlying
Benefits.
daily stuff and benefits that you do, right, which relates to mental health maintenance. And I called it that because mental health and maintenance, because it is an ongoing tune up every day, right? And someone like me who's bipolar and I take medications every day, and I'm much more conscious of not only do I have to be conscious of what's in front of me and doing those things, I also in the background are always analyzing like, am I off? Am I balanced? Am I not? And all that. And it's a hard it's a at first it's hard to kind of live that way because you're just kind of like second guessing yourself and all that. But you know now, but it speaks towards the idea of being in the moment. That's a big
Mm.
thing, right? Like staying in the moment. You just got to stay in the moment. Like we hear it all the time. Like it's not a new thing, right?
Yeah.
So I guess how I got to mental health maintenance over the 10 years of my own self discovery was, how do you do that every day? Right? How do I do that every day, dealing with
Mm.
what I have to deal with? And how do I stay in the present moment?
No, that's what's coming in my mind is that as an emergency physician, I see a lot of people in their acute phase of mental health, and a lot
Yeah.
of that is bipolar, mania, psychosis, lots of things.
Yeah.
And sometimes we see these patients come back to us over and over, and some I know that a lot of people struggle with it on a long-term basis. I don't think I've ever met or got to know someone who's gone through that and then turned their life around on the other side and
Mm.
doing what you're doing in terms of maintenance. What was the crux of all of it? What changed everything for you?
Great question. Um, I've referenced this idea of this book a few times, and I think probably now is the way to talk about it. And if you know me long enough, I have a story for everything. So the quick story of this book before I tell you the book, um, I actually was living with a few dudes, early 20s, that kind of thing. They were a little bit older than I, and my one roommate, he read this book and it kind of changed his life a little bit. And he went on this kind of pseudo spiritual journey. He like went away to like Thailand for 2 weeks and just lived in like a hut and, drank, 10-cent beers and things like that. And he told me about it, but I was early 20s. I'm like, okay, cool. But it always just stuck in my head. And so during the time where I said I was hitting the wall randomly, this is how things like this usually happen. I was doing something completely unrelated and the book popped up in my head. And I was like, oh, I should try that out. So I went to the local used bookstore, and I'm not making this up, but like I remember like I was walking down the aisle towards the bookshelf and I literally like spot it like 20 feet away, like this book spine. I'm like, whoa, there it is. And it's like literally like at eye level. And I grabbed it out. It was 99 cents. It's a great deal.
Wow.
And I actually didn't start reading it until like 5 months later. And I was reading it to and from work. I rode the subway every day. Sorry, UK people, the tube in the US. And I, it was, so this book was a phenomenon when it came out. Came out in the late 60s, early 70s. I can't remember exactly when, but it was kind of at the height of the beatnik hippie movement, anti-war stuff. And it kind of became like the hippie Bible of the time, right? The author, he's talked about like it's called like it's like the book is like the world on the turtle's back or something like that. Like it
Hmm.
just was very philosophical. And this is what's really interesting. So reading it, it was like, and I'm sure you had these moments where you're like, wow, like what this dude's saying are like things I've thought of but never spoke out loud. And it just, and slowly but surely, and then increasing in speed, like it just started firing all of these thoughts of like just, beyond every day. It starts getting to the metaphysical world and like starts exploring like when the Greeks were kind of figuring out logic back in the day and all of those kind of things. And it was just basically cracking open what we kind of assume are true and seeing if a lot of those fundamentals are still applicable today. So, um, so the book is motorcycle Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance
Okay.
by Robert Pirsig. He actually wrote a second book called Lila about 20 years later in the early 90s, which is an interesting piece to this, but I'll finish on Zen. So as I was leading up, you know, he has an interesting story. He was like a genius, identified at like year age 5. He was in college in biochemistry. I think it was his major at 15. He flunked out of the first year because he just couldn't get his head around school and all that. And then he was served in the military, all this stuff. He did study in India and things like that. Like, so he really kind of expanded his knowledge of philosophy. And then he kind of pivoted to that as a focus area.
Hmm.
Anyway, so reading all of this, and I remember it's hard to explain, but like, even though I didn't know what was happening, deep down in the soul, like you felt something was coming. Like my mania was kind of on its way because my speech patterns and what I was talking about was just it was just, I'm like frantic. I'm like, oh my God, this like discovery and this and that. My wife was like, what the fuck is going on? So, And I got to a point in the book. The book is 4 sections, basically sections off with multiple chapters each. And I got to the end of the beginning of the fourth section, and
Hmm.
the way the story was progressing. Because it's like his personal story and then his philosophical thoughts woven in together, so they kind of worked in tangent. And I think that deep soul feeling kind of knew something was up, and I literally taped the rest of the book together, like that section. So I never
Hmm.
read it. All right.
Okay.
And then the mania started. And then it was like 3 days, no sleep, up all night. I was on my roof in my underwear. I was running around the neighborhood. Like, dude, I
Wow.
could have a whole podcast just to tell you about that, those 3 days. And so, anyway, there's a point to this too. So, flash forward, I was diagnosed. I was in a mental hospital for a week. I did outpatient for a week, and then I was back at work. And my doctors were like, okay, you seem okay, because although all that philosophy stuff that I was reading from Zen, in theory, accelerated my mental health breakdown,
Hmm.
all of those thinking and all those thoughts still were there. And they actually were what I used to power my new self, if that makes sense. I kind of had this new lease on life, and I'm like, oh, this is what I am. I'm going to be a great person. I go back in the world. Anyway, sorry, I digress. It was maybe about 5 months later where I actually I cut the tape and I
Okay.
read the rest of the book. And my first psychiatrist, like, he was like, oh, I don't know if you should read this book anymore. I'm like, no, it's cool, man. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm on the meds. I'm good. I'm good. Um, and I read it, and it was basically describing the 3 days that I had, because basically what happened was he ended up having a 3-day mental episode, and he was actually put into the mental hospital, and it was just so crazy, literally,
Yeah.
because I'm reading this and it's like, I mean, it's almost verbatim exactly what was me, what was happening. It was like his wife's crying in the corner and he's just
Wow.
staring at walls and he's doing all that. And it just that one threw me for a loop. I was just like,
Hmm.
whoa, like, now back in the 60s and stuff, psychiatry wasn't the way. So he ended up having 26 electrical shocks
Oh gosh.
to basically wipe his brain clean. And so his book is written from that new person's perspective, and he came out later and said, because the ending is a little confusing for folks, is that the writer who's writing this is his new self, but it's a fraud. And actually his old self was slowly coming back to his mind, and so he ended up writing the book based on all these fragments of his old life coming into play. And he kind of he looked at all the notes he wrote and tried to kind of find some semblance of what this guy was trying to do.
Hmm.
um, and anyway, so yeah, that one, and that was a pretty messed up day. Like, I didn't know what to do with it. I still don't know what to do with it. It's like, what does it mean when you read all this stuff and then you literally do the same thing this guy did? And yeah, anyway, he passed away in 2017, which sucks. I actually did have this small hope maybe I'd meet him one day. Yeah, I remember I felt, anyway, I'll stop
Wow.
there. I'll stop there.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Mm.
That is so phenomenal. And like you lived exactly what the book said. And then on the other side, there were the same sort of principles that you were finding and discovering for yourself in terms of what you
Mhm.
need to do to live this life differently, now knowing your brain in a completely different way. And and now you incorporate that into your coaching approach.
Mhm.
Tell me a bit more about
I do.
that.
Um, it's a little bit loose right now. I'm still new at the coaching, right? But, focusing in. So, as I said, like, and as you just mentioned, like, I was embedding mental health and some of this philosophy to anyone who would listen, or if people were struggling and stuff. So I was coaching before I was even officially a coach. Um, so the premise and how I kind of work with my practice, generally, and then I'll do a specific, is, mental health maintenance isn't just for people who are diagnosed mentally ill, right? It's for everyone, right? And the point of it is that the way our world is built and our society has been built, that mankind has built over whatever 40,000 years since, we started as Homo sapiens, it's so complex and it's actually very oppressive if you really think about it on ourselves. So like mankind created a very oppressive system for itself, right? Not intentionally, it just kind of how it worked, right? Things got more complicated. And um, so it's really based on here's what I kind of do every day, right? And then some of the stuff I've already said, this is how I think, and it's without ego, and I want to be a good person. But it really is helping people to grasp. Sorry, I want to say this right. One of the things I think, one of the main points out of Zen, which I hold very dearly and I try to convey in different ways, is the biggest challenge we have right now is the method of how we think in and of itself. Persig in the book really focuses on reason and logic and how, and I've kind of expanded on it. It's like it's the tool that mankind discovered to make what it's made, right? Like you can't deny that logic and reason and this and that and cause and effect and like it built everything we have. You can look around at the majesty that humankind has created. However, I'm also a big believer in balance of life, and a lot of philosophies talk about balance, and I talk about that quite a bit. There's always the yin and yang. So, for all this splendor we've created from reason, there is actually this very ugly negative that's kind of invisible to all of us. And you can see it and feel it when you look at society and how they're dealing with things and struggling. It really comes down to the idea of yes, no, black, white logic is no longer capable of handling the complexity that we are now dealing with today. And I think a lot of the challenges we're having is that people still think in that mode. They can't not. Like it's ingrained in you from the beginning. It's actually something you're born with, I think,
Mm.
really, right? Like comparing, right? This or that, right? But think about it. But everyone says the world's so gray. But the way we think is black and white. And the way I say black and white are just guideposts right now, and black and white changes and all that. But I think that's the challenge we have is that we're struggle trying to reconcile gray by using these
Mm.
tools that can't handle gray, right?
Mm.
Like it's got two slots, white and black. Like I don't, you got this spectrum of gray all over the place. Um, so I think that's part of the beginning of any relationship I have with someone like a client is let's talk about thinking,
Mm.
right? Because we talk about present moment, you got to be in the moment. But the minute you start thinking, you're not in the moment anymore, right? Like, unless you're thinking about something very specifically, but like, think about it, right? Oh, I thought about this thing I did yesterday and you ruminate over it, you're not in the moment, right? Oh, I'm thinking about tomorrow's mortgage payments and I got to do this, I got to take my kid to soccer and all that. You're not in the moment, right?
Mm.
But it's just so natural to us, or it feels so natural that we just kind of keep doing that. So that's where I start is the foundation there. So it's two things. One is understanding how we think, right? And understanding where it's useful and not useful. The second component is I think a lot of the things I've talked to people about, it's by challenges with others and all that. So I think the second part is empathy and really instilling what empathy actually is. I've thought a lot about that. Like I know there's a definition in the dictionary and all that. And everyone says, hey, be more empathetic, right? Like, oh, yeah, that's cool. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. And then this guy cuts you off tomorrow, in his car. And then you're like, like no one tells you how to do it, right? And how do you do it consistently,
Mm.
right? And so that's part of maintenance. It's because you don't live in this world in a silo. You have to interact with others and all that. And I think once you are able to reconcile and actually live more with empathy for others, it unlocks the betterness in you, and then you actually will become more fulfilled from it.
Mm.
Those are two things. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever, but
That
I'll
does make so
pause
much
there.
sense, and I'm not sure what's coming to my mind is directly related or not, but we kind of been
Sure.
talking about stressors, right? Like when you went through a really stressful time in your life, both the first time, the second time, and that's what kind of led to I guess your manic episode and then your admissions, and like, as from a perspective of a clinician, I know that we often look for stressors like what's going wrong, and we spoke about the 6 F's before. We said friends, family,
Yeah.
forensics, finances.
Hmm.
I can't remember the fifth and sixth one, but
Yeah.
these common things that often are like things around in your life that you need to keep maintaining, and when some of them go up and down, they're usually the most common stressors. And this is probably something that people, even like, even if they don't have it formally diagnosed, or like any mental health diagnosis really, can sort of relate with that. Like when stress is high, when things are going wrong, that's when it's a bit of a struggle. And so talk to me about like what your perspective is on stressors, and what your perspective is on how mental health maintenance deals with them.
I mean, you kind of hit it on the head already a little bit there. Yeah. So stressors.
Hmm.
I think the first thing, or one of the early things, I won't say first. Everyone's journey is slightly different, right? I mentioned empathy as a core, right?
Hmm.
The final statement for it that I talk to people about is the idea that every person has one shared thing. Actually, we have many shared things, but in this case, this one main thing that none of us chose to be born
Mm.
in the first place. Sometimes I do this cleverly, and I'll ask you, Shub. So, Shub, tell me when you decided you were going to have dark hair and dark eyebrows, and you're going to have really nice teeth and all that. Like, when did you do that, and how did you decide which color skin you wanted and all of that? Like, it's just kind of like this little brain thing that you kind of start with, and then you realize, like, oh, I didn't do any of that, I just popped out. you know
Yeah.
but that choice wasn't made for you. It was made however you got there. You didn't choose to be born, right?
Mm.
So on top of that, you didn't choose who you were born into. You didn't choose what family you had, what culture you were born into, what economic status you had, so on and so forth, right? Like, it's kind of a crapshoot, so to speak. And then every person is kind of put into these kind of class. Let's be fair, like, the world is classes and hierarchies and tiers and all of that kind of stuff, and you can choose that. And so as you navigate your journey in your life, you're going to be heavily influenced by the people around you, and that starts forming your own moral code and your value systems and all of those kind of things, right?
Mm.
What's important to you, what's not important to you. The big problem there, though, is that's associated a lot with the objects we have. So the actual money I have, what kind of car do I have? And we use those to compare ourselves to each other. Again, comparing logic, going back in, like,
Mm.
if I worked like him, then I would could get this. Yeah, maybe, maybe not. Right. Or I love the phrase, if I were you, I would do it this way.
Hmm.
No, if you were him, you would do it exactly the way he decided to do this. Right. Like, give me a break, right?
Yeah.
Like, you
Yeah.
don't make a decision based on one aspect. You make every decision based off your entire life's journey and everything you've learned so far, like in
Yeah.
an instant. Like, all that stuff fires. Okay. I'm going
So
somewhere with this, I promise you.
I'm
Yeah.
just gonna
Go ahead.
like share my story in between all of
Yeah.
this. Is like,
Yeah. Do it.
my friends and my family and my wife often know me as the person who does could have, should have, would have, right? Like, oh, I could have done that. Oh, I should have done that.
Right.
Like, oh, if this hadn't have happened, I would have done things differently. Or like, if I went back and did it again, I'd do it differently. And then it just hit me one day, and it's like, oh, if I put myself back in that exact time, in the exact same situations and the exact same scenario, I would do exactly what I did, because that's literally what I did. And then it kind of like, it changed for me, and it became like, oh, if I could have and I should have, then I would have, instead of
Mm-hmm.
looking at it like, oh, why didn't I do that?
Right.
So yeah, yeah,
Right.
just resonating with
Yeah.
what you were saying
No.
there.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I hear you. Like, exactly. You're getting it. Right. So the whole point of this was the empathy thing. So these objects, and we use them to compare. It's what gets in the way of where I'm going with this, right? And
Mm.
why I said the one big thing, like one of the biggest life choices, aren't made for us, right? You and I come from a different place, right? What you've experienced, the people you've met, the things you've owned, the things you've done, all of that kind of stuff is different than what I have, right? I mean, we're both coaches now, which is great, right? I wouldn't even try to like put myself in your shoes in that way, right? Just like we were just talking about. Like, there's no way I can conceive of every single element of why you decided to do X or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
right? With me. However, and this is where those objects and comparison and logic get in the way, the desires, the emotion that we feel on those are the same. So if you were to tell me something really bad going on in your life and you're very, very sad about it, right? And it's like, I've never met like maybe a loved one is ill or something like that. And I've never experienced a loved one ill with that thing. But I know what being really sad is.
Hmm.
Like, I know how that feels, right? Like, I know what pure joy feels like. I know what it feels like to be happy, and so do you. Who gives a crap what it was, what happened? Like, no, I mean, sorry, playfully saying, like, it doesn't necessarily matter, right? Because we get into this, as an example, we get into this competition thing of like, well, you don't suffer as much as I do,
Mm-hmm.
and oh, you have no idea. Like, no, I don't know. I actually don't know what it feels like to have
Mm-hmm.
this, and this happen, right? Just as much as you wouldn't fully appreciate, being bipolar and your wife being bipolar in a year, but you can appreciate the situation. You can put yourself in it just so far to feel it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think, if anything, that's the underlying layer of commonality that we can exist under, right? It's like we all know what feeling like crap is, right? Why aren't we working together to try to eliminate a lot of that kind of crap and that feeling, right? But that goes back to, we don't have a shared underlying, you know, value system that we all can use. Sorry. So this is all back to the stressors. I know this was a very long way to get there. I think that's what's helped me deal with the stressors more than anything else, is that because before I would be like, oh, this is so unfair and people don't get this and I'm just the victim all the time and da 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 da. And you realize, like, I actually don't control a lot of what happens to me in my life. Actually, what I control is how I react and how do I deal with it. Like, that's the only thing I really control. Like, life's going to throw whatever it wants at you. So it's going to throw every kind of struggle
Hmm.
at you, right? And whether it's me or whatever, the object is different, but the sentiment and feeling that I'm experiencing is the same,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you reflect and say, okay, when's the last time? And you do this instantly. This is not like I sit here for 25 minutes thinking this. Like, this happens, human brain's so fast. It's amazing, right? Like, you relay it back and like, oh, I felt it this way. I addressed it this way and I came out the other side successful. And so you build on that every time and say, okay, this sucks. And I could tell you, like, Shub, you only know a piece of that. Like, my years, like, we have had the weirdest crap happen to us. Like just bad things happen, unexpected and all that, but we've persevered every time. And then the bipolar thing happened and we persevered from that. So that's one of the biggest ones that we can hang our hat on. And
Hmm.
at some point you have to realize, like, persevering each time is no longer coincidence. It's who you are and you can do it. And so you can then kind of project it forward and say, and so you compartmentalize the suffer or the stressor, and it's like, it's temporary. I know how to deal with this. I just have to keep my mind steady. I got to focus on the present. This is all mental health maintenance stuff, right? Because right now, this is the most important thing. I'm going to focus on it. I'm going to do it well, right? So, anyway, that was a long way. So, like, the empathy thing is part of that, because it's like, it gives you grace to understand, like, your feelings are valid. You've had them before and all of that. The object doesn't matter, right? The goal is to get to a peace of mind. That's a big thing.
Hmm.
The object of everything you do is peace of mind
Yep.
in life. And that's the road to having less regret when your time is over. That
Hmm.
could be a whole other conversation, right? Like, everything you
Yeah.
do,
Yeah.
right?
So I guess if someone's looking for peace of mind, find Stephen Ringer on mental health maintenance.
I mean, oh, actually, you know what? I used the wrong, like, so, like, person of good.
Yes.
I use mind of peace.
Mind of peace. Ah,
Yeah,
I'd love a mind of peace.
right.
A piece of my mind.
Because a peace of mind sounds odd to me. It sounds odd to me, right? I
It
get the
does.
idea, peace of mind, but no, I like it the other way. Like, I want a mind that is peaceful,
Yeah.
right? I don't, like, peace of mind sounds more temporary, right? But a mind of peace is a philosophy,
Hmm.
and you work every day towards that end, right? I say this a lot. Like, your goal every day is to go to bed saying, "All right, I'm at peace with how I handled my day," right? Knowing that everything you do is not going to be fully successful. Some things you try your darndest and it doesn't work out, but that's not the point, right? Because there's so much stuff, as I said, out of your control when it comes down to it. But the goal every night, it's like I can rest easy because everything I've done is to accomplish the goal of peace of mind. But the companion to that is I'm trying to be a good person, right? That's the other thing. People could spin what I just said in other ways and devious ways. Like, that's the precursor. It's, you want to be good, and then the goal is peace of mind, and every action you do is towards that end, right? I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. This is such a fantastic and refreshing look at how we see mental health, and not just from like a clinician's perspective, but also from somebody in the thick of it. Both from saying, "Hey, there's a fix to it," versus saying, "Hey, it's an ongoing process to help you find a mind of peace."
Mm-hmm.
And what was the other one?
A person of good.
And help you be a
Person of
person of
good.
good. That's
Sure.
exactly it. And I think
Yeah.
on that note, we'll come to a close on this podcast. Where can people find you, Stephen?
That's a great question. I have a small little portal, mhm.today. Mainly is I couldn't afford the .com on that, but actually the today I think it makes sense, right? Mental health maintenance, it starts today, and then tomorrow it's today, and so on and so forth, right? Because today is the only day that matters, right? The
That's it.
past is past, the future's unwritten,
Mm,
right? Today is where you change your futures. Today is where you set yourself up for success tomorrow, so on and so forth.
I love it.
So
And
mhm.today online, feel free to book a free discovery session. I'd love to chat with you and to see if maintaining your mental health day to day would work for you.
and you're also on LinkedIn.
I am also on
Can they
LinkedIn.
reach out on LinkedIn?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I'm an old LinkedIner, so I don't have any numbers on mine. So it's /in/SW Ringer, and then there's a small mental health maintenance page on LinkedIn as well.
All right. Fantastic. And likewise, I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can find me on coachwithshub.com. Oh, and if you're not signed up yet, I've got an impactful clinician newsletter. So if you're a clinician listening to this, I should probably set this right in the beginning. But yeah, please do sign up to my newsletter.